Okay, so welcome everybody to Nova Scribes. Tonight we're looking at social proof storytelling by Eric Ratinoff. A little bit about Eric. Eric is the founder and chief storyteller of Story First, which is a strategic storytelling firm that helps companies and organizations get clear about their story and tell it more effectively. His 20 plus years of deep experience as a writer, editor, director, strategist, teacher, and coach have helped him help a wide range of companies, nonprofits, and political candidates tell their persuasive and most compelling stories. And Eric, it's great to have you here. I ran into Eric. We were both doing a job up in Providence, Rhode Island for a mutual client, and he was leading them through telling their story. And it was really cool watching him do what he does. This was a group that was having a hard time telling their story, and Eric was able to help them out. So Eric, how about I transition it over to you? What have you got for us?
Thank you very much. That sounds great. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see if I can make this do what it's supposed to do. Hang on. All right. So thank you for the introduction. Yeah, it's interesting. You suggest a mutual client who's having trouble telling their story. I often find myself people coming to me saying we know we've got a good story to tell, and we're having trouble telling it. And actually, I kind of wanted to start off with a story of one of those clients. Some of you may be old enough to remember the days of the flip camera. These were basically the next generation of the first digital cameras pre-iPhone. Back in the flip camera days, I had a client of mine that sent flip cameras to some of their most loyal customers, and they asked them, they said, "Could you record testimonials for us? Send them back and we'll post them on our website." And the customers were delighted to record these videos and help spread the word about it. Was a software company. They loved the software. They wanted to help spread the word, and that software was making their lives better. Did the videos have the desired impact on sales? Did they persuade a lot of potential customers to subscribe to the software? No, they did not. And the problem really with those videos was not the customers that they sent the cameras to. It was that when they sent the cameras to those customers, they asked for a testimonial. And maybe you're wondering, and if you're here, you might well be wondering, why is that a problem? I thought testimonials were good. I thought I was supposed to be getting testimonials. And the problem with asking for a testimonial is that when you ask somebody for a testimonial, their mind reaches for compliments. And what that means is that they usually say nice things, and often that makes you feel good. But because people will go reaching for a compliment, most testimonials are pretty much filled with interchangeable platitudes that sound very nice, but don't really connect with or persuade an audience. And so in working with this company and learning more about kind of some of their frustrations with these testimonials, I was able to convince them and the marketing team that there was a better way to approach this. And we sat some of those same folks down for interviews and asked them, tell us the story. What was your experience of working with this company and their software? And when that was the question, we got something completely different. We got very specific, vivid details about what life was like before the software, what they discovered when they first started using it, reservations they had about investing in a new software, because everybody's bombarded with software options, and then ultimately how the software made their work easier. It decreased their stress, it improved their communication, it gave them time back. And because they told a complete story from beginning to end, it was persuasive in a different way than just the interchangeable platitudes of a testimonial were. And so that story gave the company, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later, they're called Newforma, social proof. And when Newforma and their marketing team shared those customer stories, and that was, we told many of them over a course of several years, instead of just those kind of two-dimensional testimonials, they grew 38% over the previous year in the first year of our working together. And so what I want to do tonight is very simple. I want to show you why storytelling is so powerful. I want to show you the structure behind stories that make an emotional connection. And then I want to talk about how to leverage that structure for social proof. And I probably should be keeping up with the chat and making sure that I'm not missing anything. It's always hard.
That's right, Eric. I'm watching for you.
Okay, you'll yell if there's something I need to respond to. Okay, great. So what we're going to start with is why storytelling is so powerful and why story gets us every time. Before we get into the structure and the craft of stories, I want to give a little context. I want to talk about what a story is, what it does to our brains, and how it works. And you may be surprised. I'm going to tell you another quick story. So when he was 3 years old, we took our son to see Finding Nemo in 3D. The first lesson from this story is do not take 3-year-olds to see 3D movies. It is way too much. But the other lesson was, while he was not old enough to understand that, if the title is Finding Nemo, that they're probably going to find Nemo, he was a little disoriented by the experience. And so even though he is not and was not then a clownfish, had never at that time been separated from us, about halfway through the movie, he's completely terrified, like traumatized, like clinging to me as hard as he could. Why? Well, like every other human, he was mapping his own experience onto the story that he was being told, and he was having an emotional reaction to it. In his case, an intense emotional reaction. He felt the feeling that Nemo felt of being alone, and it terrified him. And science gives us an understanding of what was happening in his little 3-year-old brain when Nemo got separated from his dad, and really what happens in all of our brains when we hear a story. So neuroscientists have identified neurons in our brains called mirror neurons, and the neurons are believed to fire in the same way, whether we perform an action or experience an emotion, or whether we observe someone else performing the action or experiencing the emotion. So if you've ever heard somebody say we're wired for story, this is what they mean. Story is working on us at a neurological level. And so in the book, The Storytelling Animal, Jonathan Gottschall describes a study by a team of neuroscientists that used a functional MRI machine to study these mirror neurons. And they scanned subjects' brains in 3 situations. One, while they watched an actor drink from a cup and then grimace in disgust. 2, while they tasted something disgusting themselves. And 3, while they listened to a scenario where they were asked to imagine walking down the street, accidentally bumping into a drunk who was throwing up, and then catching some of the vomit in their own mouths. Now, I always am a little bit hesitant to share this scientific research because it tends to evoke a rather physical reaction in people. But you see what happened. I was telling you a story about a study where people were told a story about a scenario that they didn't actually experience, and 3 degrees removed, you probably had a physical reaction. So you probably won't be surprised by the punchline. In all 3 situations, the same parts of the brain lit up in the brain scans. And so mirror neuron researcher Marco Iacoboni describes this phenomenon this way. He says, we react to movies like my 3-year-old did because mirror neurons in our brains recreate for us the distress that we see on the screen. We have empathy for the fictional characters. We know how they're feeling because we literally experience the same feelings ourselves. So does it matter that we know consciously that Nemo is a clownfish? No. We still react. We still feel that fear in our guts because that emotion is being mirrored in our brains. And this is why I can get, fired up to take on the universe by Chewbacca, even though am not myself a Wookiee, and I've never been to outer space. It's why I can be inspired by Rocky, even though I've never been in a boxing ring. Though I am from Philadelphia, and I will be the first to admit that we are a little bit weird about the Rocky thing. But when we know the stories involve real people, like the stories that you will be telling, and they're true, like the stories that you will be telling, it's even easier for us to map our experience onto those stories. It's even easier for us to make an emotional connection. So Paul Zak, who's a neuroeconomist, which I think is one of the coolest job titles I've ever heard, says that stories that are personal and emotionally compelling engage more of the brain and thus are better remembered than simply stating a set of facts. So, all right, we know we're wired for stories. We're ready to go tell our stories, right? Well, I'm guessing if it were that easy, you probably wouldn't have signed up for the workshop. So if we're wired for stories, why do we struggle to put them to use? Often we struggle because we fall too easily into storytelling traps. And in working with people and companies to help them become more effective storytellers, I've identified a number of traps that very intelligent people, like all of you, fall into all the time. And there are many, but I want to share two specifically with you today. So the first is the curse of knowledge trap. So what's the curse of knowledge? Simply put, once people know some piece of information, they find it hard to imagine what it was like before they knew it. So I learned about this from Chip Heath and Dan Heath in their book Made to Stick. They talk about the mind of the novice, that when someone's introduced to something new, they have the mind of the novice. They don't have the mind of the expert. But research suggests that a key barrier to crafting effective messages is the curse of knowledge. Once people know some piece of information, they find it hard to imagine what it was like before it. Their own knowledge makes it harder for them to communicate to someone who doesn't know it, and it thus becomes a curse. So put another way, when you suffer from the curse of knowledge, it means you've become such an expert in whatever it is that you're doing that it's hard to remember what it was like not to be an expert. And because of the work that you're doing every day, you're an expert about a lot of information that the average person knows very little about. And thanks to that deep knowledge, that immersion in your area of expertise, you've learned a whole alternative language. My guess is no matter what your expertise, you've got your own set of jargon, you've got acronyms that mean something like that instantly to you, but to someone outside of your circle, don't really mean anything. And when you have that disconnect, unfortunately, it doesn't stop us from talking to our audience using the language of the expert. And there's I would say, a sad fact about humanity, which is when we are confronted with somebody whose speech is, littered with jargons and acronyms and expertise, but who speaks confidently as if everybody should know what the jargon is and what those acronyms mean and what they stand for, most of us are too polite, too intimidated, or too embarrassed to admit that we don't really understand what you're talking about. And we'll just be like, okay, that sounds great, and just go along. But that does not necessarily mean that your message has gotten through. It just means that it's been received. And so just because someone's nodding their heads, don't be confused. Don't assume that they're getting it. But if you can step away from the jargon and the knowledge that you have as an expert and tell somebody a story about real humans and about the work that you do and how it affected those real humans, then you give that audience the ability to map their experience onto that story and then make this emotional connection. Now, when I talk about stories, particularly client stories, customer stories, whoever it is that you're serving, the kind of people whose stories you might want to tell, one thing that people sometimes get hung up on is the specificity of a story, which I call the universality trap. So, people say, well, but that story, it's a really good story and it really illustrates what I do really well, but it's really a very specific situation. And I don't know if, what happens if people don't relate to that story? Their circumstances might be different. And I get the theory, but in reality, that's not how our brains work. We don't need the circumstances of the story to match ours exactly to be able to relate to the situation or the struggle or their hopes and dreams. And again, for this, I give you Exhibit Nemo. My son still is not a clownfish, had never been separated from his parents, still terrified. Again, he's mapping his experience onto the story he's being told and having the emotional reaction. We're going to talk about what specifically in that story he was being told created that connection most powerfully. But the takeaway for me is, don't be scared by specificity. Don't be scared by that very specific story of the person that you helped or the impact that you made, just because it's an unusual circumstance. If anything, we should be scared off by the trap of generality. And I think that happens a lot in testimonials. It happens a lot in a lot of the case studies and the videos that I see people produce. They boil it down to sort of the lowest common denominator so that it feels like it will make sense to everybody, but in reality it doesn't. And maybe it does, but it doesn't make that emotional connection. So the specificity of the story, the details, are what help people imagine themselves in a similar situation and allow them to relate to it. And stories not only give people something they can relate to, it opens the door to trust. Stories can effectively illustrate who you are, what you value, and the impact that you make in a way that encourage trust more than facts, more than features, more than declarations of your values. And that's one of the things that I see also a lot is that people will talk about, well, these are our organizational values. Anybody can put, whatever they like as their core values on their website. It doesn't mean anything. But if you can tell me a story that says this is what these values look like in practice, when we say we are inclusive, this is what that looks like. Suddenly now it's concrete. And I can say, oh, like I see what that means. It's not just a value they're talking about, it's something that's lived. And so when you are telling a story, you give people the opportunity to see themselves benefiting from what you do more than the facts can, more than the declaration of your process or your values ever can. The stories of the people whose lives that you've impacted have the power to persuade other people at a gut level because they can trust you. One of the other things, Newforma, I'm picking on them, but not only did they send the flip cameras to their customers, before that they had done a bunch of what I call the talking VP videos. So they had all their vice presidents and their co-founders talking about all the things that they did. And of course, they are convinced that they're making a compelling case. But put yourself in the shoes of the audience. If the VP of a company is talking about how wonderful their product is, you understand at minimum a subconscious level, but probably at a conscious level, this person is trying to sell me something. But if one of their customers is telling you about their experience, they're more trustworthy because they don't have something to gain. Presumably they're not getting paid. And, that's why you sometimes see those disclaimers that this is an actor or this is a paid endorsement. But that person who's just telling the story because they experienced it has a measure of trust that you as the purveyor of the service that you provide or the product that you're selling can unfortunately never have. And so it's not that you're not telling the truth. It's not that you don't have important and powerful things to say. It's that trust barrier in a world where everybody feels like they're trying to be sold almost all the time, that trust barrier can be really high. So stories let you get past that barrier. They let you clear that hurdle. And so now that we know how stories work and we know a few of the storytelling traps to avoid, and we know that trust is essential to the kind of relationship building that you want to do with your audience, now let's talk about how to tell stories that earn trust. So first, what is a story? I know I'm kind of teasing you a little bit. I keep telling you we're going to do something, and there's always something else we have to do first, which kind of sounds like me trying to get out of the house with my children. But we're now at the point of really digging in. What is a story? And at its most basic, there's a lot of ways that you can examine it, but at its most basic, a story is simply a series of things that happen to someone or something. And the key word in that sentence is series. So, I ran my car into a tree this morning is a thing that may have happened, but it's not a story. It's the series of things, the sequence that makes it a story. And, if we were chatting in the Zoom room before we started and you asked how I was doing and you were fully expecting me something like, oh, I'm doing good. How are you doing? But instead I said, actually, I ran my tree into a car this morning. You would probably want to know the story. Are you okay? Like, what happened before you ran into the tree? What happened after you hit the tree? Did you just walk away? Like, are you okay? And you want to know, your brain automatically wants to know what is happening in that series of events. And those pieces in sequence are the building blocks of a story. And, if I had run my car into a tree this morning, in fact, and was still standing here in front of you, you can bet there would be a story to tell. Even if it was just like, I was really dumb and looking at my phone and, which has never happened to me. So I try to avoid that. But anyway, you get the point. The better question, and I think the question that's more relevant to our quest today is, what makes a good story? What makes a story work? What makes a story make an emotional connection? And so I put this to you, the audience, and you can put it in the chat. What in your experience makes a story work?
So again, finding your way to chat. What in your experience makes a story work? Let's get a few ideas.
Uh, can I respond?
Yes, you can respond verbally as well.
Okay. A story works because it draws people in and they get involved. They want to hear more. They want to experience it. They want to physically feel good about what they're doing. As a place where stories were always told in our house, it really is how Eric grew up, with storytelling around him all the time. Crazy stories sometimes, but definitely stories. And he would stop to listen.
I need to hit escape because I can't get myself to the chat.
I can read it for you if you like. So,
Well, I want to be able to see.
okay.
It'll help. Okay. All right. So, a lot of stuff. Emotional connection, tension to resolve, conflict, then rise back up to a better place. You can see it in your mind's eye, draws people in, they get involved, helps you out, and or you can relate to it, a sense of reliving the story. These are excellent. Excellent. Has to be some, I don't know what's happening with my cursor now. I'm not, oh, there it is. Has to be some sort of arc. We want to hear the characters. We don't want too much, but we want to know just enough about them. Beginning and middle and an end, follows a path. Conflict, excellent, excellent. So I think to put some descriptors around what you all put in there, you're talking about drama, talking about suspense, tension, conflict, surprise, trouble. All of these are important elements of the story. And in my experience, in a story that works, something is at stake. And something changes. Now I can't get rid of the chat. Very strange. Don't know why that's happening. All right, we're good. So something's at stake and something changes. And that may seem kind of simple or even simplistic, but what we're going to do now is look at how these two elements are essential to effective storytelling. But because clearly I like to tease you, I'm going to give you two things that story is not. A list of facts is not a story. And we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but I want to reiterate. The facts are not enough. The facts almost never truly speak for themselves, even though people will tell you that all the time. Excuse me. One of my favorite pieces of evidence is that if facts were enough to persuade people, we would not see people standing outside of a hospital in scrubs smoking cigarettes. And yet, if you've ever driven past a hospital, I know there's one a couple blocks from me, you can see people standing by the little cigarette thing. These are not people lacking in facts. They work in a hospital. They have the facts. They are not persuaded. I mean, you could also argue that nicotine is more powerful than facts. But regardless, the story is not just a list of facts. It can and should include many facts, but a list of them, no matter how impressive or persuasive they might seem to you as the purveyor of those facts, is not a story. And then coming back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, a testimonial is not a story. And, because storytelling is a bit of a hot topic these days, I'm seeing more and more people who think, oh, we need to include stories on our website and in our marketing materials. And that instinct is good. But what happens is that people don't ask people to tell their story. They ask for a testimonial. And the difference between a story and a testimonial is that you get testimonials and they sound like this. Everyone is still raving. Thank you so much for all of your amazing. And I'm redacting the name of the guilty party to protect the innocent. Blank created a mesmerizing and memorable event for our team. Simply magnificent. Now, if you are the person about whom those words are spoken, that makes you feel good. You also have another distinct advantage. You know what that means because you were there. But most of the time, we're putting testimonials in front of people to try to convince them that they should work with us. And we're using words of people who have worked with us and are suffering from the curse of knowledge. they have this shorthand. And so when they say, oh, mesmerizing and memorable event, simply magnificent, that automatically triggers memories, a visual picture in both the speaker and the person who's putting that up as an example. But in the person that doesn't have that firsthand experience, I don't know. And the reality is, and I've done this in a lot of different workshops where I take testimonial quotes and redact the names of the company. And I've asked people, can you tell me the company that you think that they're saying these nice things about? No? Okay. Can you tell me maybe the industry in which that company operates? No. So if you can remove the name and it becomes a meaningless quote, is it meaningful when you put the name back in? I don't know. And so, thinking about what's happening here, you've got these are quotes that are like most testimonials, which have this very non-specific, vaguely positive feel. And to me, it makes a lot of testimonials not only interchangeable, but it makes them very kind of meh. And I will confess that I've been playing with the idea of using the term meh-stimonials, but it feels a little cringy to me. So, I mean, I guess we do a quick poll in the chat, thumbs up or thumbs down on meh-stimonials, but don't give it too much thought. All right, so enough about what's a testimonial, what's wrong with them. Let's get to what's happening in a story. So a story's got a unique fingerprint. It has a clear starting point. We're going to talk in a minute about where to start. A story's personal. Remember, it's about the storyteller's experience. A story's sequential. We remember that from before. There's a series of things happening to the person, beginning with that starting point. The story has a clear ending point. And then between the starting point and the ending point, something has changed. And this really gets at the core of why testimonials fail, because in most testimonials, we don't experience any change. We just get the happy ending. I assume everybody here is familiar with Star Wars, or at least the basic plot concept. So think about this. If Star Wars was just Luke blowing up the Death Star and then getting his medal at the end, would it be meaningful? Would it be a cultural touchstone for several generations of humans on this planet? Would it be emotional? Would it be memorable? Would it be satisfying? Of course not. You wouldn't know everything that he had to go through to get to that payoff. You wouldn't know the struggle, the difficulty, the pain. The happy ending is only satisfying because of the journey that led up to it. And it's satisfying because of the contrast between where he started and where he ended up. So when you give your audience a testimonial, which is basically a series of platitudes without any pain, it's not satisfying. It's not meaningful. It's not convincing. And it's not that the people saying all these nice things about you are not telling the truth. They're no doubt happy with what you've done for them. They're convinced, and that's why they're giving you the testimonial. But when they only share the happy ending, it's not going to be convincing to the people that you need to convince. And those are the people that have not yet experienced working with you themselves. And perhaps more importantly, if you only give people that happy ending, it doesn't earn the trust because the happy ending doesn't feel earned. But when you have somebody tell their story from start to finish, they're taking you on this journey that led to that happy ending. And so it's kind of like a flight simulator. A story allows you to take an emotional test drive. And then after vicariously experiencing the full journey, the happy ending that you get at the end now feels earned. And the audience can imagine themselves having a similar happy ending. Because as we've seen, we have a pretty good ability to map our own experience onto a story. Now, at this point in the workshop, I have a lot of people who will say to me, okay, this is great in theory, but I don't have time for that kind of detail. I've got like one line of space on my website, or I'm in front of a room full of impatient people with a PowerPoint behind me. I have to get to the point. I have to get to the part where people say really nice things about my company very quickly, because people have a short attention span. Anybody agree with that statement? People have a short attention span? For those of you who do agree, bear with me for a minute, because I want to reframe that assumption for you. How many of you watched the entire series of, say, I don't know, Ted Lasso, or Breaking Bad, or Mandalorian? Has anybody watched all of them beginning to end? So I would argue that the problem is not that we have short attention spans. That is a story that we tell ourselves. What people do have a low tolerance for is boring. Because remember, we're wired for stories, right? So we don't think stories are boring. We think a list of facts are boring. We think interchangeable empty platitudes are boring. But we don't think stories are boring because we can watch them for hours. So if you capture our attention, if you tell a story that quickly piques the interest of your audience, you earn their attention just for a little bit, just enough. But if the story you tell continues to be interesting or even intriguing to your audience, you can earn even more their attention. But you are constantly in a quest to hold that attention bit by bit. And a story is a much more effective way to hang on to that attention. And if people aren't paying attention to what you're putting in front of them, don't blame them and their short attention spans, because they probably watched all of Ted Lasso too. Like, look in the mirror and be honest with yourself and ask, is my stuff boring? If you want people to pay attention, your job is to make sure that your stuff is not boring. So now the teasing is over. We can get down to it. How do you tell an effective story? How do you tell a story that earns and keeps your audience's attention? There are 5 key elements to telling the story. The first seems somewhat obvious, but you have to have a protagonist. Who is the hero of this story? Who should we care about? I'll give you a hint. It is not you. Going back to our Star Wars reference, you get to be Obi-Wan. So using you may have heard of the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model. There's like 12 phases and steps into it. It's like referenced a lot by people that really geek out on the story stuff. You don't need to worry about the 12 steps of the Joseph Campbell hero's journey, but you do need to understand that in that model, there's a guide. And in Star Wars, which borrows very heavily from that model, that's Obi-Wan Kenobi. But the hero of your story is the person that you've helped succeed. It is not you. And that's because you want the person you're talking to imagine themselves as the hero of their own story. You want to give them a story that they can identify with, empathize with, and map themselves onto the experience of the main character. So the next step is the problem. What is in the hero's way? And so this is the challenge or the sticky situation that the protagonist is facing. If this is the story of someone that you helped, then the challenge is what is making things hard for them when they came to you. In most cases, the place where the protagonist confronts their problem is where you will start your story. So quite often you want to start by establishing that foundational problem that connected the protagonist and the guide, which is you. And one reason it's really important to get clear on the problem that you are solving with whatever it is that you do for people is it comes back to this issue of authenticity and trust. So lots of people talk about, delivering value or making a difference in people's lives, and that's nice. I don't want to dismiss that people are doing that, but if we don't demonstrate that we truly understand the struggle, then our audience won't truly understand or appreciate the difference that we've made. And you want to show with concrete details, not abstract concepts, how the pain of before, in contrast to after, how the pain of before looked and felt. Because the people that you want to reach, they want to see the before pain. They want to make sure you understand what it's like to be them right now. If they're coming to your website and they're looking for a solution, they want to make sure you get them. Because if you can't demonstrate that you understand their problem, can they trust you with a solution? I think it's a fair question. But if you can tell them a story about a problem that they can then see in their mind's eye, well, they're going to want to know how you solve it. So I don't know if anybody has any journalism in their background, college paper, high school paper, or something like that. But one of the first lessons that I was taught as a cub reporter, as a student journalist, is one that has really stuck with me to this day. And that is this: show, don't tell. I can tell you all day long that, we're really making a difference. We're making things better, whatever it is that we do. But until I show you what that actually looks like, I'm probably not going to persuasively convince you that we can do it. And nothing can show you more powerfully than a true story that's well told. And that leads us to our next element. Stakes. What is the cost of the problem? So we talked about earlier, for a story to work, something has to be at stake. And this is where the attention comes in, because it's not just about what the problem is. The problem is the context for the story. what really gets people's attention is the cost or the potential cost of that problem. So the cost of the problem is what's at stake in the story. And determining the stakes for your hero answers really a fundamental question for your audience, which is, why should I care? And I think one of the things that I often find is that people are confused about the stakes. They may be able to describe the problem state, but they don't dig in enough on what that means. Because the problem, like I think, I'll go back to my Nuforma example. The problem that they were helping people solve was information overload on construction and architecture projects. But what was at stake was people were having to stay at the office until 7 o'clock because they couldn't find what they needed and they couldn't get things communicated. Or projects were delivered weeks, months late and over budget because they didn't have a hand on their information. So the problem is important, but the stakes are why this was so urgent, why a fix was really something that they were willing to invest in. And if you can make the stakes clear, people are going to say, yes, I feel that pain. Even if it's not exactly the same, they feel that fear. So either in the chat or verbally, what are some examples of what's at stake for the protagonists of your stories? People feeling excluded, helping more animals faster. I'm going to push back on that. That's sort of what it's the ending the suffering that I think is more of the stakes. The stakes are animals are suffering and dying because of the problem state. Lane says getting or not getting a promotion. Okay. Overwhelming loss of talent and thus the success of the partnership. All right. Now we're getting to the stakes. When these things are not happening, opportunities are lost. We're feeling that pain. And so, to get clear on the stakes of your story, think about the protagonist, why this challenge matters to them, and not just the stumbling blocks they run into, but the cost of those stumbling blocks. What are they worried about? That's what keeps them up at night. That's how you figure out what's at stake for them. And if you can frame those stakes effectively, your audience is going to be able to relate to the stakes that the protagonist is facing, even if they're not in the same situation, which means they're going to want to pay attention to find out how the story ends. And again, it's not the situation that we relate to with Nemo, it's the stakes. Fear of loss, fear of separation, fear of abandonment. That's what we react to. That's what my son was reacting to, not the situation, but the stakes. So you really have to ask of your story, what is at stake here? And it's really, really important to get clear about this, because if nothing's at stake or you cannot convey what's at stake, you don't have a story. Now, once you've established the stakes, the next key element is solution. So how did the problem get solved? Then earlier we said a story is a series of things that happen to someone or something. It's the series of things, the sequence that makes it a story. And between the starting point of the story and the ending, right, something has to change. So if you've set up the stakes properly and you've established the problem or the challenge or the struggle for the protagonist, the audience wants to know. Their brain wants to know, how did you get out of that situation? Did it work out? How did it work out? What we want to know is the answer to that all-important question. And then what happened? And as you walk us through the steps in the process, there has to be a change. And that change may be simple. In the beginning, I was afraid of this. I was worried about this. And by the end, that worry was gone. Or it may be much more complex, depending on what you do and how you deliver that solution, all of those things. But there has to be a change. And the key to making this work as a story is that you help us understand how that change happened. You walk us through that process. And then finally, to give us closure, to make the story satisfying, you have to tell us what that change means. So this is sort of as the stakes are to the problem, the impact is to the solution. So what is life like for this person now? What is different or better now? Why is that meaningful? Why does having this problem solved? What does having this problem solved mean to the protagonist? Because this impact is what your audience is thinking about when they come to you. You all may be thinking about the process, what you do, how you make the difference in people's lives. And often when we communicate from what we want people to know. But your audience, they're thinking about impact on them. They're thinking about what solving that problem means to them or to the people that you're serving. So to recap, to tell a story that works, we need these 5 key elements: the protagonist, what the hero of the story, the problem, what's in the hero's way, the stakes, what's the cost of the problem, solution, how do the problem get solved, and the impact. What is the benefit of the solution? So I want to give you a quick example of what this looks like in practice.
2 weeks ago, we had to put out 200 drawings, and the naming convention changed as I was actually issuing these drawings. Back in the day, when we didn't have these systems, that would have taken me at least a week to go through 200 drawings, change the names of them, change the titles, the drawing numbers. You know, it's endless work. It's mind-numbing work as well. With New Forma, it took me, I think, 17 minutes. I think I actually clocked myself and just said, it's 17 minutes to change 200 drawings and print them and send them out again. You know, so it's an absolute game changer for us.
We don't have the luxury of time. So anything that helps us be more efficient and brings together different platforms that we have to work with, that's really important to us. And I think New Forma helps us do that.
So as I was sat at the desk and I'm in the model, if I got a phone call, someone like that saying, move a chiller by 200 mil, I don't know which chiller it is. I don't know why he's asking me to do this kind of thing. Whereas with the mobile apps, what I can actually see is that information right there. And it's going to take me, I'm assured I'm at the right chiller. I'm moving it in the right direction. Yeah. It's all logged. I've done it. And we send it back to site. You know, something that would have taken us 5-6 days. And we probably wouldn't have got it right the first time. Now it takes up a couple of hours and we know that it's exactly right. You know, and it's checked on site by the guys who need it.
All right. I'm going to stop share for a second. Okay. I'm going to check the chat. Sorry. For some reason, I'm not able to see my cursor. Okay. What about if there was not that great an ending despite what the hero did? Can you hold that thought? We'll come back to it. All right. Let me go back. Okay. So let's break this down real quick. Who's the hero of our story? It's Dave. What's in his way? The naming convention has changed. It's a very basic problem, at least in the engineering world. What's the cost of the problem? Time. Used to take 2 weeks, and it's painful work. It's mind-numbing work. So what's the solution? How the problem gets solved? Well, New Forma, this software package. And what's the impact? What's the benefit? Well, time saved. 17 minutes this time. He clocked himself. And then you have more impact. You have Nigel saying, we don't have the luxury of time. So anything that makes us more efficient, that's really important. So Nigel, who's seeing the bigger picture for the client, is corroborating the larger value, the broader meaning of those time savings. All of that happens. The whole story arc, protagonist, problem, stakes, solution, impact, in 48 seconds. You can tell a very meaningful story very quickly. And then, for good measure, we tell another quick story that reaffirms the original point. So who's the protagonist? It's Dave Lee again. What's the problem? He got a phone call. He needs to move a chiller by 200 mil. Again, typical problem for him on a typical project, totally relatable. And if you've worked on projects, you can relate. What's at stake? He doesn't know which chiller it is or why it needs to be moved. He doesn't say this explicitly, but the implication is he's been asked to do something. He's in the dark a bit. So the risk is he gets it wrong, causes a delay on the project, and or it gets yelled by somebody on the job site. How do they get that problem get solved? New Forma's mobile apps. They let him see the information right there in the drawings. And what was the impact? He gets it right without any confusion. Provides clarity on what needs to be done. He knows he's at the right chiller, which is, it's an air conditioning unit for those of you that don't speak British. He's moving it in the right direction. It's logged, and he sends it back to site. Time saved once again. Something that would have taken 5 to 6 days and maybe not have gotten right the first time now takes a couple hours, and they know that it's right because it's checked on site by the people who need it. 2 complete stories in a minute and a half that show how New Forma saves time and helps you avoid the pain that comes from mistakes and confusion. Now, I can tell you from experience that it always helps if you can get somebody to tell their story in a British accent. But even if you cannot, using the basic story structure of protagonist, problem, stakes, solution, impact can help you telling a compelling story that will grab the attention of your audience, draw them in, and get them to stick with you until the end, and ultimately make a persuasive case for whatever it is that you want to sell them. So this feels like a good place to pause and answer the question that was asked. I'll stop my share for a second. The second part is to really peel back the curtain on how we get to making a story like that, how I approach the actual process of going from zero to a finished product like that. So Karen's question was, what about if there was not that great an ending despite what the hero did? Karen, I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. I was just trying to find the document for this system integrator that, had the way things are supposed to be, in their documentation, but it was totally absent in, how they implemented this project. And so they came in and, said how great they were, but they didn't tell the people who they were going to be working with what it meant, what it was going to mean for them, because these people were brought over from one company to another company. And then they just didn't know if they had a job, if they were valued, and people were just fleeing from this company. And I got there like 1 month after the project started. So, I communicated, alerted them to that, and the sponsor did come in and, say that we are intending to keep you all. However, they didn't, the whole company didn't have a commitment to organizational change management. And they said, you know what, we're just so overwhelmed. We're going to bring you back, in a couple months after we're done. Anyway, they just did not do things. Although they had the plan, they didn't execute it. And then they kind of continued. And someone else came onto the project, and I followed up with him. And he said, oh, it was a disaster. I got out of there as soon as possible. So, you try to do the best work, but sometimes it's just a disaster. And, I was thinking of how to turn that around. And that is why you need to have things not just in a PDF. You need to have it lived and acted on. So that's what my thought was about, from what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think
others have said just don't give that story, but it was so powerful, like what not to do,
so stories can be really impactful with unhappy endings as well. It really depends on what you want that story to be a story about. And I think if you're thinking about it in the context of testimonials, then, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but I think you have to think about who is the kind of client that I want more of. Because
not that one.
Right. And so I honestly, I don't think I would tell that story unless there's a like, you are wanting to demonstrate I can deal with even the worst situations. Let me tell you about this disaster I walked into, which can, again, has value. It doesn't necessarily show that your solution is going to solve the problem, but it does show you're not going to be easily scared off. And there's some value in that. But I think thinking about what is the story that I want to tell? Is this one that maybe I just don't, I kind of keep it to myself, or I tell it at happy hour when we're bemoaning the challenges of work. And that's the thing, you are always constructing the story of you and the work that you do. And so you get to choose the client stories that you will put out to the world. And I will say this. Also have worked with a lot of folks who are like, all right, we did that one story. We're done now, right? And I think the value of specificity is that it's more persuasive. It's more clear. People can really map themselves onto that story and trust that it's authentic because of the specifics and the details. But it may not be representative. And so, I'll go back to Informa since you're now acquainted with them. They sent us to 6 cities, 5 in the US and to London, obviously. And we interviewed like 35 of their customers because they wanted to tell a whole variety of stories, but ultimately all of those stories aligned around a singular narrative. And so the more you watched those customer stories, the more you were convinced, even though they were different. They had some that were in architecture, some that were engineering, some that were construction, but each one seemed to highlight similar themes, similar strengths. And so it then reinforced that. So I don't think you want to rely on one story, but you don't also have to use all of your stories. So I wanted to, I see Renika's question. What if you're working with someone and things have changed and they don't remember or can clearly name the problem? I think I may have answered my own question. So one of the things that I would say, Renika, is, and that's a great question. I think, and we'll get into this in the next section as well, part of what you want to do is sort of be an investigative reporter. You want to go back in time and take them back in time with you. So basically, when you start that conversation of gathering their story, you want to say, do you remember, like, when you first found me, what were you dealing with? And, anything that you can do to help prompt them, like, I remember we met at this conference, or, you first reached out to me in the fall of 2020, like, what was going on? Like, give them some context to take them back. Because usually with a little bit of prompting, people would be like, oh, right, I remember this. And if you have notes from that first conversation, you can say, I remember you mentioning this. A lot of times something like that will jog their memory. My guess is you can get them back there. It may just take a little bit of work. And then, do not underestimate the power of the "and then what happened" question, because it's not leading, but it makes them think, what did happen next? Oh, right, then we did this. And you want to get them thinking through that process. And so I see your follow-up question is this different for written versus audio? And wondering if the same story would have had the same impact if you were reading it. Well, if you had read it in a British accent, we're going to talk about that in a second as well. I think my own bias is that in the hierarchy of impact, particularly for these kinds of stories, video is the most powerful because you can see what's happening. You can hear the voice. There's an intimacy to that. You can tell the story on multiple levels. You have the story that the person is saying, and then you have the story that you can tell with the visuals, the nonverbal. And depending on the context, you may be able to have, maybe it's photos, maybe it's action footage that illustrates what they're talking about. And then there's also the layer of, can you put something else on the screen, text, animation, that speaks to people in a way that just seeing someone talk at you or just seeing the other moving images doesn't quite do. Because as I would imagine most of you know, animation or something that you're rendering graphically taps into a completely different part of our brain. So video lets you do all of those at once. I think audio is really powerful. If anybody else is a podcast fan, having someone's voice in your ear is really powerful. And I think you could very much put, audio on a site, or you could send somebody an audio link, or you could essentially do those in YouTube or as podcast. You could complement that with words. And then, my home base for me is as a writer. So I will never discount the power of the written word. And I think you can do a lot in writing that is hard to do in video or audio because you're omniscient, you have control. And so you can bridge some of the gaps, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. But, you know, when you interview somebody, they say what they say. And as an editor stitching together video or audio, you're often confronted with the reality is, oh, I wish they had said this because it would really join this sentence they said and this sentence they said, but they didn't say it. In video, you can put a title card on the screen to kind of bridge that gap. In audio, and if you listen to a podcast or, you know, NPR, you know that the narrator will come on and say, and then before the next week happened, you know, this happened, and then you come back to the quote. In a written piece, it can be much more seamless because you can plop a quote in halfway through the sentence, and it just feels like that's what the person said, even though you're paraphrasing the first half and not putting it in quotes. So there's pros and cons to all of them. But one of the advantages if you go video is that you can always work your way down. So if I record video, I have the video as an option, I have audio as an option, and I can transcribe it and either share the transcript raw, or I can edit it and do that as an option. So it gives you the most options to work with. All right, any other questions? These are great questions. Excellent. All right. So let's dig in, and Renika kind of jumped us into the next section on kind of how we get to this finished story. So let me share my screen again. And I hit play. I will hit play. Okay. So the first step is finding your protagonist. Who is the protagonist that has a story worth telling? And the recommendations that I usually give are, if you're trying to figure out whose story you want to tell, well, first of all, don't feel like it can only be one. You know, it can be many. But who is somebody that you feel like is an example of you at your best? And maybe that's because they were the most cooperative client, and they really trusted in you and brought out the best in you. Or maybe they were somebody that had the hardest situation to start with, and you really helped them travel the furthest distance. If you are wanting to grow your audience with more of a certain client, that is certainly the one that you can think about. And so, you know, it may be industry specific. So it's like, I've worked with people in a bunch of different industries, but I feel like I like being in the healthcare space and I'd like to get more healthcare work. Tell the story of somebody in the healthcare space, because it immediately will, even if they are not necessarily representative of your entire portfolio, they are proof you can do what you do in the healthcare space, for example. And they don't even have to say anything. You just identify them as working in some sort of health space, and people will understand, okay, like this is that they can operate in that space. So my hunch is that you probably have somebody in mind that's an example client. What I'd like you to do is take a couple minutes and write down the names of at least one person that you think that you've worked with that is a good story to tell about working with you or your company. And then I want you to answer these questions about them. And this is more like almost like getting you started in the process, so you've got something for later. And obviously, if you want to share, that's cool too. But I want to give you a couple questions just to kind of write it down for yourself, to think about who that person might be. And then, as much as you can remember, what the problem was they were faced with, the stakes, the solution, and then the impact. So take a minute or two. All right. So now that you're back, obviously you need to find who you want your protagonist to be. And if you want to get them to tell you a story that will provide social proof, of course, you have to get them to participate. But one thing that I've learned is that when people have had a powerful experience that's made a positive difference for them, they actually want other people to experience that positive difference as well. So often what I find is if you ask people if they would be willing to share their story, they usually say yes. And if you've got a good relationship, then they understand you're helping them or they're helping you. So I think often people are scared, and I've had people say, oh, everybody says I'm supposed to get testimonials and I hate asking for them. And I would say, yes, I understand that, because asking somebody for testimonials feels like fishing for compliments. Whereas if you say, hey, I want to help people understand what I do and its impact, could I talk with you about your story of working with me? That's going to feel very different to you and to them. And as you go into that process of engaging with those folks, there's one thing that I want to keep in mind, and it's relevant to these questions that you are thinking about. When you begin this process of extracting this story, of drawing this story out from the person that you want to talk about the work that you do, you may think that you know the story that you're going to tell, but keep an open mind, because you're engaging in a process of discovery. My friend and filmmaker Dan Habib says that when you go about making a film, you're actually making 3 different films. There's the film that you plan to make before you begin shooting. There's the film that you capture when you're filming. And then there's the film that you discover in the edit room. And those stories are rarely exactly the same. And I've experienced this a lot, that, not only do I get a surprise in the interview, I'm talking to somebody and I'm asking a question and I'm curious. And then I ask a follow-up question and I follow that thread, and where it goes is somewhere I had never expected. And it's a piece of their experience that I had no idea about, despite whatever pre-interview I might have done or whatever prep I might have done. And often that thing that you don't expect is the most interesting thing, and the thing you actually want to share when you are sharing a story. And then I've also often had this experience of something that they said that didn't necessarily hit me at the time, but as I'm stitching the story together and looking at the transcript, I see a line and I'm like, oh, I don't even remember them saying that. It was buried in this long paragraph, but it's a great expression of something meaningful. And it's like, oh, okay, I've discovered something new that I missed live and in person, but now I've got it. So be open to the fact that you don't know going in what you're going to get coming out. So the next step in this process is prepare your interview questions. So, we talked about this a little bit, in the beginning for the protagonist. What was life like before? What was your introduction to working with me? How did you first hear about us? The problem, what were you facing? How did you feel about that? What is in the hero's way? What do they want or need? The stakes, what was the cost of the situation for you? Solution, oh, sorry, I accidentally put some of the kind of free stuff in there, but how did you first get introduced to the work that I do? What were your first impressions? Did you have reservations? And then once we got started, once you decided, yes, I wanted to move forward with this, then what happened? What did it look like? Can you describe it? And then impact, what's different or better now? What can you do now that you couldn't do before? What's the benefit of the solution? What did having the problem solved mean to you? And then you conduct the interview. And I have a couple suggestions for when you're interviewing with somebody. And I will tell you that until the pandemic, I had never done an interview. I'd done interviews when I was a student reporter with a little dictaphone. But in the last, 15 years, almost every interview I'd conducted was with a camera rolling. And the idea of doing it over video conference seemed bizarre, but suddenly we didn't really have a choice. And so I started doing video production over Zoom. Zoom allows you to record in HD. There's some tricks that I'd be happy to share about how to make sure you get the best quality, video and audio quality. And what I learned, as much as I will always want to shoot in 4K HD with 3 cameras and a boom operator to get me the best sound. As much as I love that, I have made videos with zoom footage and the Ken Burns effect on still photographs that have brought people to tears. If you have the right story, certainly a fancy technology, the best craft will enhance it, but you can really make an impact if you get the story right. So Zoom is obviously an extremely accessible way to do this. You can record, you can edit, you can do all of those things, layer images and text on top of it. So the first recommendation in terms of the interview is ease into it. So start, even though you know who the person is that you're interviewing, I always start by asking them to introduce themselves, talk about what they do, where they live, just some basic information. You want to get people warmed up a little bit, get them talking. Ask them for essentially the first pass at the story. One thing that you may find if you're going to do an interview is sometimes people will want the questions in advance. If I'm concerned about them being really nervous, I may share the questions. I will usually share some themes. I'll say, I'm going to ask you about this generally. But the goal is for the conversation to feel natural, because when someone is reading something that they wrote in advance, it feels like it's scripted. It feels less authentic. The sentiments may be just as meaningful, but if it doesn't have some of those hesitations, it's not going to feel authentic. And if you share questions in advance, and I've had this happen, people will prepare their answers, come with those answers written out, and want to get the same exact questions and read the same exact answers that they prepared, because they think that's going to make them more comfortable. It tends to make them a little bit more comfortable, but it doesn't help you. So if you find somebody's come with prepared answers, that's okay. Ask them if they'd be willing to put them down and not read them, and let them know that it's not important for them to remember exactly what they wrote down. One of the things I always say to people when I'm interviewing is, there isn't a right answer. You are the one that has all the answers. It's your story. I just want you to tell it to me. And a lot of times that helps people relax. I also will say, and we're not broadcasting live, so if you don't like your answer, you can say, can you give me that question again? Or you can stop midway through and start over. It's a process to get somebody to relax and really get to the good stuff, which is yet another reason why sending somebody a flip phone and asking them to record a testimonial usually won't get you what you need, because what you're going to get is somebody's first pass. And so it can take time to really get somebody warmed up and get them where you need them to be. One of the other things that I often have is people are like, oh, I don't, I'll ask a question like, oh, I don't have the numbers to answer that question. Usually the numbers are not important, and you can always put the numbers on the screen later. What you are trying to get is, what did it mean? So if they have the numbers at their fingertips, bonus, but if they don't, that's fine. Okay, the next thing is be prepared to pivot. So you should be prepared. You should have questions in advance. You should also totally be prepared to abandon those questions after the first one. Follow your curiosity. Let the conversation go where it wants to go. And most importantly, or so often, the most important question is the follow-up question. I often joke, I say to people, the reason that you're hiring me is for the follow-up question, because that's where the good stuff is. And so you really have to be listening. You have to really be engaged in the conversation. You can't just work your way through the list of questions, or you're going to miss something. And that may well be the best part of the story. Revisit things from earlier in the interview. So a good way to start off is to say, talk me through the story of working with me. They'll give you a kind of a surface level overview. Go back, dig in on certain pieces. You mentioned earlier that this happened and then this happened. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, who was in the room? What were the details like? Go back and dig for those details. And it's okay to repeat questions. One of the things that I always say is, don't worry about repeating yourself. I may ask a question from a slightly different angle to see if I can get you to phrase something in a slightly different way. It's not that I wasn't paying attention. It's not that you're repeating yourself. It's that I'm fishing and I'm casting a wide net, and I want to get as much as I can. The next thing I will say is, typically you want to get, or you always want to get way more than you need. typically my raw interviews are at least 10 times longer than the finished edited video. The video I showed you was 1.5 minutes. The interview with Dave Lee was 28 minutes long, and the interview with Nigel was 32 minutes long. So that's about 60 minutes of video or 60 minutes of interview for 90 seconds of video. And that's kind of a normal proportion. So you really want to get as much as you possibly can. Sometimes to the point where you feel like you are exhausted, the person you're interviewing is exhausted, you can't possibly think of another question to ask. That said, never stop recording until the door closes. And if you're in the room with somebody, like, don't stop recording until they've literally walked out of the room. If you're on Zoom, don't stop recording until they've hung up. So often, the best lines come at the end. I think it's because people are warmed up. They're more comfortable being interviewed. They're more comfortable talking about their experience. They're more comfortable talking with you. And if it's gone well and you've done your job, then you've earned more of their trust. And you know, they've been thinking about and talking about this topic for 20, 30 minutes, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of things bouncing around their brain. They're ready to put some things together that they may not have done before. They may say, like, you know, I never thought about it like this, but, and one of my favorite questions is to say, is there anything that I should have asked that I didn't? And often people will be like, no, I think you got everything. But sometimes you get somebody go, you know, I really thought you were going to ask me about this. Oh, okay, great. Tell me about that. And, you know, maybe it's another 10 minutes, but if you're open to that, there's usually some really good stuff there. And then the next step in this process is you script the story. So you transcribe what you've got. I'm a big believer in rev.com, which is like 25 cents a word. It's AI, or sorry, 25 cents a minute. So it's affordable. It's pretty accurate, and it makes it easy to review the transcript and listen to what's being said to kind of cross-check it. But a lot of programs now automatically transcribe. So I don't know if it's the specific Dropbox plan that I have, but if I go to a video or audio file in Dropbox in the browser, it will automatically generate a transcript for me. A little bit less accurate. It doesn't identify the speakers, but it's free. So start with a transcript. I like to put it in a Google Doc. And as you review the transcript, you start to see the contours of the story. So I like to highlight in the document. So my transcripts will look like this. This was the interview with Dave Lee. You can see I highlighted in green. These are great lines. I think I want to use them. Sometimes there'll be yellow lines like, yeah, maybe this will come in handy. And I put all the quotes into a separate document that I think that I want to use. I call it a quote corral. And then I start to script, like, what is the order in which I want to put these things? And then the next step in the process is you edit the story. And maybe you think, well, you know, we don't have the ability to do video editing. That is totally understandable. If you just want a story that you put in print on a website, then that's fine. The process still applies. Like I was saying before, I recommend starting with video as your source, because from video, you can go kind of down the ladder. You can take it and turn it into a video, audio story, written piece, social media post, whatever it is. But if you have the ability to edit video, all the better. So editing is really, you put those pieces together. You know, how does it sound? How does it flow? And remember, you are the storyteller. So you're piecing the story together for your audience. And even the best, most natural storytellers that I've worked with, I don't just put what they said in the order that they said it. I take what they shared, I layer it onto the narrative structure. And I keep in mind that as the storyteller, it's my job to distill the story down to its essence, make sure I'm not going off on long tangents, decide on what the narrative arc is, where are we beginning, where are we going, where are we ending, and tell it in a way that's going to create the audience. And I also mentioned before the need to create bridges. Sometimes you go to stitch the story together and you realize they didn't say that thing that would have really put these two lines together perfectly. I wish I'd asked about that. And, you know, if it's Zoom, maybe you go back and you say, hey, can you wear the same shirt? And I'll ask you one more question. Or you just kind of proceed and you create your own bridge. And the easiest way to do that is in film, it's a title card, text on the screen. In audio, it's you as the narrator stepping in and explaining how you got from point A to point C. And in writing, you know, it's just kind of stitching those direct quotes together with the context that you provide as the writer. But ultimately, that's just you as the storyteller helping to move the storyteller. Sorry, it is you as the storyteller helping to move the story forward in a way that serves the audience, and it's a helpful tool to keep in your back pocket. And so that's a lot of like really wonky behind the scenes stuff. But I felt like for those of you hoping to take this on and try to do it on your own, it's good to know that piece of the process, not just the narrative structure, but like, how do you actually do that stuff? So that is kind of the end of what I have prepared. I would love to hear your questions. And it looks like we've got some in the chat as well, or it's got something in the chat that I can't see because of my Zoom issues, but
Says, where can we view some examples of the Zoom videos you have done?
I can share those with you. Let me well, I'm not gonna do that now. I can, if you, I'll put my email address in, and you can put it or send it out to folks, but if you can email me your email address, I would be happy to send you some examples. Do you want ones that will bring a tear to your eye, or are you looking for just more generic?
Karen, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, a tier or two. And then, what are the best sources you recommend for how to create videos remotely? Because, again, that's been coming up, and, I always said, well, how do they do that?
Well, I have a little bit of a cheat code. I have a video editor that works with me. And so what I do is I get him the raw footage and I draft the script, and then I share that Google Doc with him, and he takes the Google Doc and goes and finds the clips, cuts them together, and then we begin the process of figuring out, like, and I guess what I should also add in the edit is often that script is too long, or it doesn't quite feels right once you actually hear the lines delivered in sequence. So then you start to edit in video based on what you're seeing and hearing. And my process is always do as much as you can on paper, because that's easiest to change. Then bring it into video, do as much as you can to get to the point where you feel like the lines are telling the story you want to tell before you add any photos or text or any of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like layers, because once you're starting to add video and text, that affects timing, and it's easier to lock as much as possible. Sometimes, and this is maybe less relevant if you're telling your own client stories, but I know for me, when I'm telling stories for a client, sometimes they're like, oh, I didn't realize that line was in there, we have to change it, and kind of upends everything. But sometimes you have to do that.
Okay. And is there any kind of ratio that how do you define how much time it's going to take you? Because, you may have other responsibilities, and they say, oh, we'd like you to do a video of this also. So how do you gauge how much time realistically it is going to take? And
so I would say if you're operating within the Zoom sphere, the shortest I've ever allowed for a Zoom interview is 15 minutes. And that's tight. Typically it'll be 30 to 45 minutes. I think that what you will find, and I see the question about, whether people will give you the time. I think if this is somebody that you've worked with, yes, they're doing you a favor, but usually they will appreciate the process. And often if you tell a good story about the work that you did with them, they'll want to share it too, because it speaks to them being able to solve that problem. I've had a number of clients who serve customers, and as part of the enticement to participate in the interview, they say, we'll give you access to the raw footage, because invariably they talk about their work and what they do. And so, we'll give you access to the raw footage, which you can then either edit yourself, or you can work with Story First to have them tell your story. And we've had a couple people take us up on that. So, again, it depends on the nature of the story that you're telling. I do a lot of pieces that are one voice, where it's one person, one story. I do a lot of pieces where it's multiple voices that are each telling a facet of the story, or the combination of their experiences telling this larger story about what an organization does or what a company does. Like right now, I'm working on a project where I just finished 8 Zoom interviews of 45 minutes each.
Mhm.
So that's, do the math, however many hours of just interviews, not to mention the prep for those interviews. And then 45-minute interview is going to be like 12 to 15 pages worth of transcript. So I'm going to have, 100 pages of transcript to go through and highlight, and then start to pull. So it takes time.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. How do you, from the interview to here's my finished product, how do you gauge that?
The only way that you can gauge it is to do it and start to get a body of work. And you're like, okay, this one took me 3 weeks. This one took me a month and a half. I mean, and it really, if you are your own client, so if you are crafting a story, you interview somebody that hired you, you're only doing one voice. It can be fast. I mean, you can turn something around really fast.
Mhm.
The flip side is, like, if you're doing something for somebody else, I find that, and nobody wants to believe me when I tell them this, but it's always true, the approval process slows things down more than almost anything else. I sent you a
Mhm.
cut to review. Oh, okay, I'll get back to you. Hey, have you had a chance to look at the cut yet? No, not yet. I'll get to it today. And so I will give people, oh, we think, we can have your first finished video in 3 weeks,
Yeah.
but you got to play your part.
I think that's true of all creatives, is that
Yeah.
sometimes the approval process takes longer than the actual creation. We're just about at time. We can keep going, but I did want to share just a couple of resources. So Eric, I love that you brought up Star Wars as as an example. For you facilitators out there, I just dropped 2 attachments into the Zoom chat. One of them is for a storybook that you can create, and I actually just sketched in what Star Wars looks like. Now, this follows the arc that Eric was talking about before, where you start with the context, you introduce the challenge, and then you have the victory and the homecoming following the Joseph Campbell arc that's there. The other thing is there's an example of a completed one also using Star Wars, so feel free to use those. Another resource that I couldn't let this go, and Eric, tell me if you haven't read this before, but Lead with a Story by Paul Smith is I think it's the most fantastic book on crafting a story. Just a little bit of context: Paul Smith was the corporate storyteller for Procter and Gamble, and that book is a gift that just keeps giving. So I highly recommend that. And I dropped that into chat. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Please hang out for the after party. But can we give Eric a big Nova Scribes? Thank you very much. Great to have you, Eric.
Thank you all. It was a delight to be with you.